Have you ever truly looked at the person sitting next to you? Or have you just glimpsed them through the filter of your own assumptions? This story, unfolding amidst the everyday hustle of a city train, will challenge how you perceive the world and those you share it with. Before we dive in, we'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and if stories that touch your heart resonate with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We're sharing another compelling tale tomorrow that you won't want to miss. The train rumbled and swayed, a metal serpent carrying its diverse cargo through the urban labyrinth. Commuters, a mix of hurried professionals, sleepy students, and quiet observers, filled the carriages. Each was engrossed in their own world, headphones blasting, phones buzzing with notifications, and others just staring blankly at the blurred landscape outside. Among them, a man named Daniel, dressed in simple jeans and a worn jacket, sat quietly in a corner seat. His gaze, however, was anything but vacant. It held a depth and a calmness that suggested a life examined deeply. He blended so seamlessly into the crowd that no one seemed to recognize him. A man of understated presence that belied his remarkable life. The morning air was thick with the usual mundane hum of the train, a rhythm Daniel seemed strangely comfortable with, but the serene atmosphere was about to be disrupted. Across the aisle, a group of teenagers, boisterous, careless, and overly confident, settled in with their usual cacophony. Their laughter and loud conversations ricocheted through the carriage, shattering the morning calm. The group's attention turned to Daniel. They began to snicker, their eyes darting towards him with ill-concealed amusement. Their leader, a boy named Ethan, with a swagger that could fill a train car, leaned forward and loudly proclaimed, "Hey, look at this guy! Still riding the subway? Can't afford a car, old-timer?" The group erupted in laughter, their mocking tones cutting through the already tense silence of the train car. A few passengers glanced over briefly, their faces a mask of uncomfortable indifference, a silent plea to not be drawn into this juvenile display. Daniel, though, remained unfazed. His face did not betray a hint of annoyance or anger, his composure unbroken. He simply adjusted his seat and continued watching the city unfolding outside the window, as though the adolescent taunts were nothing but background noise. Ethan, emboldened by Daniel's apparent lack of reaction, pressed further, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Can't hear us? Or are you just too broke to care?" He and his friends continued their assault on Daniel's quiet, with their words landing like sharp needles on the air. Some passengers began to watch now, their initial avoidance turning to apprehensive observation. A young woman nearby frowned, her discomfort evident, while an older gentleman offered Daniel a sympathetic glance, though he wouldn't intervene, bound by the invisible rules of public transport etiquette. The tension in the train carriage had thickened to an uncomfortable level, and everyone waited for a reaction, for the anticipated explosion that never came. Finally, Daniel turned his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's. His gaze was steady but calm, and his expression unreadable. He asked quietly, "Why does it bother you so much?" His voice was even, lacking any trace of defensiveness, which threw Ethan off guard. The simplicity of the question seemed to deflate Ethan's bluster for a moment. Ethan stammered, caught off guard. "It's just weird, you know? Someone like you riding the subway. You look like you don't belong here." The other teenagers quieted down, their laughter replaced by an uneasy anticipation. Daniel smiled faintly and asked, "And where do you think I belong?" He leaned back in his seat, his composure unchanged, not goaded nor provoked. Ethan, now feeling the weight of the other passengers' gazes, shifted uncomfortably, his confidence wavering. "I don't know," he stammered. "Somewhere else, I guess. Somewhere with people like you. Better people." Daniel leaned back further, his posture relaxed. "I think I'm exactly where I need to be," he said calmly. "Sometimes, it's not about where you're going. It's about who you meet along the way." His words were simple, but they carried a subtle wisdom that seemed to resonate through the carriage. The other passengers began to exchange curious glances, the atmosphere shifting subtly from tense to quietly inquisitive. Ethan, attempting to regain his lost bravado, gave an awkward laugh. "That's deep, I guess." Daniel didn't respond. He simply turned his attention back to the window, his actions suggesting the conversation was over. The passengers on the train were now intrigued, their eyes glancing between Ethan and Daniel, each one waiting for another moment to unfold, sensing something significant had shifted in the stale air of the subway car. That moment had turned from a normal commute to a profound experience. But Daniel wasn't finished. As the train began to slow, nearing the next station, he stood up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Ethan without a word. Ethan, thoroughly confused, hesitated before unfolding the paper. His face paled as he read the note, his bravado evaporating entirely. What is this?" he stammered, looking up at Daniel, who was now smiling gently. The other passengers craned their necks, trying to get a glimpse of the note. Ethan's friends exchanged nervous glances, their earlier amusement replaced by a palpable unease. Daniel ignored the question, gesturing towards the train doors that were beginning to open. "Come with me," he said simply, his tone both gentle and commanding. "I think it's time for you to learn something important." Ethan hesitated, pride warring with his curiosity, but something in Daniel's calm demeanor compelled him. He stood slowly, clutching the note tightly in his hand. He stepped off the train, leaving his friends behind, and followed Daniel onto the platform. The doors slid shut, and the subway pulled away, leaving the passengers to wonder what would happen next. Ethan followed Daniel onto the bustling platform, clutching the note, his earlier swagger replaced by a cocktail of curiosity and unease. The station thrummed with life, rushing commuters, echoing announcements, and the hurried rhythm of the city. But Ethan's entire focus was on Daniel. Without speaking, Daniel started walking towards the station exit, his steps measured and deliberate. Ethan hesitated before hurrying to catch up. "Hey, what's this all about?" he asked, holding up the note. Daniel glanced at him, his expression calm. "What do you think it's about?" Ethan unfolded the paper again, reading the simple words written in neat handwriting. "Judging someone doesn't define them. It defines you." He frowned, the weight of the statement beginning to sink in. "Are you trying to teach me something?" Daniel smiled faintly and replied, "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just giving you an opportunity to think." They emerged from the station onto the busy city street. Daniel pointed towards a bench nearby, and they both sat down. Ethan fidgeted, unsure of what to say, finally blurting out, "Look, I didn't mean anything by what I said back there. I was just messing around." Daniel tilted his head, studying the boy. "Messing around at someone else's expense? Why?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding Daniel's gaze. "I don't know. It's just something to do. I mean, you were just sitting there, looking all serious, and I don't know. It's not like I hurt anyone." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Words have power," he said quietly. "They can lift someone up or tear them down. You might not think you hurt anyone, but you don't know what someone is going through. A kind word could make their day. A cruel one could break it." Ethan looked down at his hands, his fingers tightening around the note. "I guess I never thought about it like that." Daniel straightened his back, his voice soft but firm. "Most people don't. It's easy to judge someone based on what you see, their clothes, their job, the way they act. But the truth is, you never know someone's story." Ethan looked up, meeting Daniel's gaze for the first time. "What's your story?" Daniel chuckled, a quiet sound that carried a hint of sadness. "It's not about my story," he said. "It's about yours, and the choices you make from here on out." The two sat in silence, the sound of the city buzzing around them. Ethan fidgeted again, the weight of Daniel's words settling over him. "So, is that why you're on the subway? To teach people lessons?" Daniel shook his head, smiling. "I'm on the subway because it gets me where I need to go. No lesson, no message, just a ride." Ethan blinked, surprised by the simplicity of the answer. He looked down at the note, the words seeming heavier now. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he said quietly. Daniel stood, stretching slightly. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Sometimes meeting someone different is what helps us see ourselves more clearly." As Daniel began to walk away, Ethan jumped to his feet. "Wait, where are we going now?" Daniel gestured towards a nearby shelter, its sign barely visible through the crowd. "Hope Haven, a place for everyone." Ethan hesitated, his curiosity warring with uncertainty, but something about Daniel's calm confidence drew him forward. As they approached the shelter, Ethan noticed the unassuming building, with people gathered outside, some sitting on the steps and others chatting quietly. A sense of humility and quiet determination permeated the air. Daniel held the door open, gesturing for Ethan to enter first. Ethan felt out of place but stepped inside. The interior was simple yet warm, with chairs in a cozy corner. Volunteers were bustling about, serving food and talking to the guests. A young woman approached, her face lighting up as she saw Daniel. "You're back," she said warmly. "It's always good to see you." Daniel nodded and gestured towards Ethan. "I brought someone who might learn a thing or two here." Ethan flushed, feeling exposed. "I didn't agree to, whatever this is," he muttered under his breath. The woman smiled gently, clearly picking up on his discomfort. "Don't worry," she said. "You're welcome here no matter what." Daniel led him to a table where an older man sat, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. His clothes were clean but worn, and his face was weathered with lines that spoke of hardship and resilience. Daniel greeted him warmly, pulling out a chair for Ethan. "This is David," Daniel said. "He's someone you should talk to." Ethan shifted awkwardly, unsure what to say. David looked up, his eyes kind but sharp, as though he'd seen more than he'd let on. "So, what brings you here, kid?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. I'm not really sure," Ethan admitted. "Daniel just brought me." David chuckled, taking a sip of his tea. "That sounds about right. He's always dragging people out of their comfort zones." Daniel leaned back, letting David take the lead. "Tell him your story," Daniel said. "I think he could use some perspective." David nodded slowly, setting his cup down. "Well, kid, I wasn't always sitting in a shelter like this. I used to have a good job, a nice car, and a house in the suburbs. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. One mistake, one bad decision, and everything can change." Ethan leaned forward, curiosity overriding his discomfort. "What happened?" David sighed, his gaze distant. "I lost my job during a company downsizing. I thought I'd find another quickly, but the bills kept piling up. Eventually, I lost my house, my car, everything. People started looking at me differently, like I didn't matter anymore." He looked at Ethan, his expression serious. "You'd be surprised how quickly people judge you when you've got nothing. They don't see you, they just see what you've lost." Ethan swallowed, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing unease. "But you're here now. You seem okay." David smiled faintly. "That's because people like Daniel remind me that I matter, that everyone matters, no matter where they come from or what they've been through." Daniel spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "David's story isn't unique. There are thousands, millions of people like him, people who have been judged for things beyond their control. That's why we need to be kinder, more understanding." Ethan looked down at his hands, David's words echoing in his mind. "I didn't realize I never thought about it like that." David reached out, patting Ethan's shoulder. "That's okay, kid. You're here now, and that's what matters." Daniel stood, glancing at the clock. "There's more I want to show you," he said. "But first, let's help out here." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Help? Like serve food?" Daniel nodded, smiling. "Sometimes the best way to understand someone is to stand in their shoes, even if it's just for a little while." Despite his initial hesitation, Ethan got up and followed Daniel toward the kitchen. His mind was racing, and he was beginning to see the world and himself in an entirely new light. Inside the shelter's kitchen, Ethan was handed an apron by one of the volunteers. He looked at it awkwardly, unsure of what to do, but Daniel quickly tied his own apron with ease. "It's not that hard," Daniel said with a faint smile. "And trust me, it feels good to help." Ethan watched Daniel roll up his sleeves and dive into the work, ladling soup into bowls and handing them to guests with genuine warmth. He hesitated for a moment, then mimicked Daniel's actions, fumbling slightly, but managing to serve a few bowls. Each time someone thanked him, he felt a small but unfamiliar sense of pride. As they worked side by side, Ethan glanced at Daniel, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "I mean, you're famous. You don't have to be here." Daniel paused for a moment, looking thoughtful. "Fame doesn't make you any more human," he said simply. "Everyone deserves kindness, and sometimes the smallest acts can make the biggest difference." After an hour of serving, Daniel led Ethan back to the dining area. They sat at a table where a young mother and her 2 children were eating. The mother's face was tired but grateful, her eyes lighting up as she recognized Daniel. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Daniel nodded humbly. "You're doing great. Keep going." Ethan observed the exchange silently, his earlier judgments now feeling small and misplaced. He looked at the mother's children, their smiles bright despite their circumstances, and something inside him shifted. As they left the table, Ethan turned to Daniel. "Do you do this a lot?" he asked. "Help people like this?" Daniel shrugged, his tone modest. "As much as I can. It's not about how much you do. It's about showing up when it matters." They stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Ethan walked in silence for a while, his mind racing with everything he'd seen and heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I think I've been looking at things all wrong." Daniel stopped, turning to face him.
"How so?" Ethan kicked at the ground, struggling to find the right words. "I mean, I've always thought it was about, who has the most stuff, the best car, the best clothes. But none of that matters, does it?" Daniel smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "What matters is how you make people feel, the impact you leave behind." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I've got a lot to learn." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "We all do. The important thing is that you're willing to start." As they walked down the street, Ethan glanced back at the shelter, the warm glow of its lights spilling out onto the sidewalk. "What happens to them?" he asked, referring to the people inside the shelter. Daniel's expression turned serious. "Some will find their way back, others might not. But every bit of kindness they receive helps them take one step forward, and sometimes that's all they need." Ethan looked down at his hands, the weight of Daniel's words settling over him. For the first time, he felt a desire to do more, to be more. Daniel looked up at the darkening sky, his voice soft. "Come on, there's one more thing I want to show you." As they continued walking, Ethan felt a new sense of purpose stirring within him. He didn't know exactly where they were headed, but for the first time, he was willing to follow Daniel. Ethan and Daniel walked through the city streets, the bustling noise fading into the background. Ethan's mind was racing, still processing all that had happened that day. Daniel led him to a quiet park, illuminated by soft streetlights. The peaceful atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the subway ride. They stopped in front of a bench, where an older woman sat, her clothes worn but clean. Beside her was a small cart, filled with blankets and supplies. She looked up as Daniel approached, a smile spreading across her face. "Daniel, you're here?" she said warmly. Daniel nodded, sitting beside her. "Of course, Margaret. How are you holding up?" The woman shrugged, her eyes filled with weariness and resilience. "One day at a time. But I can't complain, people like you make it easier." Ethan stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Daniel gestured for him to sit down, and after a moment's hesitation, he did. Margaret looked at Ethan, her gaze kind but penetrating. "Who's this?" she asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Someone who needed to see what kindness can do." Margaret chuckled softly. "Well, you've come to the right place. This park has seen its fair share of stories." Daniel leaned back, letting Margaret take the lead. She began to share her story, how she was a teacher, how she had lost her home due to medical bills. But instead of bitterness, her words carried a quiet strength. "I may not have much," she said, "but I've learned that sharing what little I have can make a big difference." Ethan listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by curiosity and respect. "How do you stay so positive?" he asked hesitantly. Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Because I've seen what happens when people come together. A kind word, a shared meal. It can remind someone that they're not alone, and that's enough to keep going."
Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Margaret. She opened it, her hands trembling slightly, and her eyes widened as she saw what was inside. "Daniel," she whispered, tears welling up. "This is too much." Daniel shook his head, his expression gentle. "It's exactly what you deserve. Use it for yourself, or for others, whatever you think is best." Ethan leaned over, catching a glimpse of the money inside the envelope. He felt a pang of guilt, remembering how he had judged Daniel on the subway. "You do this a lot, don't you?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "It's not about how much you give, it's about how you give. Small gestures can mean the world to someone." As they left the park, Ethan turned to Daniel, his voice unsteady. I want to do better. Be better. I didn't realize how much I was taking for granted." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to start. Every choice you make from here on out is an opportunity to make a difference." Ethan nodded, determination sparking in his eyes. "I'll remember that." They stopped at the edge of the park, the city lights stretching out before them. Daniel looked out at the skyline, his voice thoughtful. "The world is full of opportunities to show kindness. You just have to be willing to see them." As they parted ways, Ethan felt a profound sense of change within him. He looked back at Daniel, who gave him a small nod, before disappearing into the crowd. For the first time, Ethan felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the impact he could have on others. The next day, back on the subway, Ethan noticed a man struggling with his bags. Without hesitation, he stepped forward to help. His actions were quiet but genuine. As he sat back down, he glanced at the note Daniel had given him, now tucked safely in his pocket. "Judging someone doesn't define them. It defines you." A small smile crossed his face. This time, he truly understood. "So what about you? Have you ever been quick to judge, only to realize you were wrong?" What does this story teach us about the importance of humility and kindness? Remember, we're all just trying to navigate the complexities of life. Let's try to walk with a little more compassion and a little less judgment. Thank you for listening to this touching story, and we wish you good health and well-being. If you've enjoyed this, remember to subscribe and join us tomorrow for another heartwarming story.